I feel a little absurd being so high up above you, and I could easily sit and be seen, but the trouble is I always feel more awake and ready when I'm standing, so I'll stand. I read an article of Master's about a year ago. It was on communities, and he was very strongly talking about this. He was saying, I didn't come to start a sect, I came to start communities, getting people to live together and live the spiritual principles and show examples of these principles. And then with great zeal, he said, I'm going to write, he said pamphlet at the time. Well, he never had the time in the years that remained him to write that pamphlet. And I thought, well, I really ought to do something more than I've done on that subject. I did write cooperative communities, how to start them and why. I also wrote Cities of Light, but they still aren't, they're too much tied into us and into our path, into our gurus. And this principle is something that the whole world needs. And so I felt that what we really need is something much more broad-based, much more universal. And I read a book that I had bought at our used bookstore, book buyers in Mountain View, California, in which the book is by Robert Downes, and it's called Books That Change the World. And as I read these things, I saw that they really sort of encapsulate the direction of modern civilization for the last 500 years and show where all of us are coming from, in the sense that this is how we've been educated. These are the biases with which we've been trained to think. These are the so-called insights, the assumptions that we've been led to make, and in one way or another, all of us have had to either be subjected to them or have actually accepted them and have had to work their way through it. But people like Copernicus, obviously, people like Machiavelli, less obviously, and yet very really, Adam Smith and the principle of laissez-faire and of private enterprise. Malthus, somewhat less known, but had a great impact. Then people you know still better, Darwin, Karl Marx, Freud. We may reject their teachings, nonetheless we've been affected by them. We couldn't help being affected by them. And it's made people, many people, made them cynical, doubtful of any spiritual values. When Karl Marx declared that religion is the opiate of the people, many people bayed like hounds down that trail. And it has been, in fact, the underlying assumption of your and my education. Well, when I was in school, I very quickly began to question all these things. It just didn't add up to me. But I'll go back and help you to see it how I saw it, and how point by point, for instance, Darwin, everybody accepts Darwin. Well, my thought on that is, so what? Why not? But does it really? I mean, when you go down a country lane, are you shying at every bush for fear of a serpent coming out and leaping at you? You're not thinking in terms of survival all the time. You may do it on the battlefield. You may doing it walking through some sort of ghetto. But you're not going to do it all your life. You're not living to survive. You're living to enjoy life. You're living for reasons that have nothing to do with anything Darwin talked about. Consciousness is what you want. Conscious enjoyment. As Master said, the real goal of all human beings is to avoid pain and to find happiness. It's that simple. What's his name? Darwin didn't talk about that at all. And same with Marx. His idea of imposing an utterly grotesque theory based on the Darwinian idea that we're really just monkeys anyway, sort of in disguise, putting a little cosmetics on, and then you have a human being. I say in this book, well, if you really want to be honest, and you think you're being honest by saying you're a monkey, why not be even more honest and say you're a worm? I mean, that's where you began, isn't it? Or even before that, some sort of squirming in the primal slush. Is that our self-definition? No, of course it's not. In fact, if you see somebody who's starting to paint a painting, let's take Leonardo, good example, and he puts a line on a canvas, and somebody comes, oh, wait a minute, I think that line should be, he'll say, now for God's sake, shut up. Wait till I've finished my painting, then you can criticize. Well, here we are, all of us trying to create a painting ourselves. We're trying to create a masterpiece ourselves. We make many mistakes along the way. And because of those mistakes, you see the errors as well as the realizations written on the face and in the eyes of every human being you meet. And there are some people who look radiant, there are some people who look dark. But those are the first lines that they've drawn on the canvas of their own consciousness. And bit by bit, and this is why reincarnation is really such an essential doctrine, because in one lifetime, how can you overcome even one fault? Maybe, but there are a lot of faults that you'd try for a lifetime to overcome. People can work a lifetime to overcome drinking and don't succeed. People can know that they should be kinder to people, and yet they still fall into being unkind, ruthless, cruel. They can't help themselves. Their habits have been set. And to blame God for that is ridiculous. We made ourselves by past lives. You can't say God put us, that God put somebody in a ghetto, in a poor home, criminal parents, criminal environment, criminal friends, criminal everything, and say, you didn't make it to heaven, you go to hell for eternity. Not fair. It's a ridiculous, a grotesque philosophy that is acceptable only because so many people have it. But reincarnation, which is a belief held by a majority of the human race, is really, as I think it was Voltaire, or may have been David Hume said, it's the only explanation that philosophy can listen to. It makes perfect sense. In one lifetime you make a little bit of a change, but it takes many lifetimes to produce a Jesus Christ. And you may say, well, he came down perfect already. Yes, he did, in fact. But how did he get there? In the book of Revelation it says that I will make a pillar in my Father's mansion, even as I overcame. He had to overcome too. What would it be? What kind of a lesson would it be if God had made this perfect human being, couldn't possibly sin, came down? With what other message would there be in such a case? Look at me, I'm pretty good, huh? He came here to show us what we can become. He didn't come here to boast. He said, what I have done, you shall do. Again and again you get that message if you listen for it. If you read his writings and his teachings, I should say, sensitively, he came to set an example, but to produce that, to produce a St. Francis, to produce a Yogananda, to produce the great people, is even to produce a George Washington. He was a great man. He had a mission, a divine mission. I believe it strongly. You know, when he was in the French and Indian Wars, he was a big man, very tall. And he rode in the front of his troops. He wasn't like those desk generals. He was right there in the front. If anybody was shooting on the other side, and we have to assume they would all aim at him. He never got grazed. There had to be some divine dispensation for him, because he had something to do. And there have been people like that in this world who you can see there's something ordained in their lives, but it isn't that God says, well, now I'm going to make a good man here, I'm going to make a horrible person here. No. We make ourselves that over many lives of effort. And bit by bit, we keep correcting that canvas to the point where that painting is equal to Leonardo. Anything that any genius, saint, whatever in this world has ever accomplished, you can accomplish. There's absolutely nothing to stop you. How did Mozart, at the age of 5, write a symphony? Because he'd been a musician, he'd been a composer, had to be. He was one time asked by a young composer, well, he was pretty young himself, a younger composer, because he died at 39, I think. Anyway, this man asked him, how can I write symphonies? And Mozart said, well, you have to start by simple, shorter things, trios, quartets, little works, and gradually work up to the point where you understand all the instruments in a symphony orchestra and can create something this complex. And the young man quite reasonably said, well, but you didn't do all those things. You began writing symphonies. Mozart's answer was classic. He said, yes, but I didn't have to ask. He was born knowing. Well, you know certain things yourself. There's certain things that all of us know we can do. And the truth is, it wouldn't hurt to have the attitude that there is absolutely nothing you can't do, so long as you don't take it to your ego and say, sure, I can do that. But if you say, no, I can't do anything, but he can do it all. If I open myself to him, there's nothing he can't do. Then you're speaking a truth. And if you can live that way, then you'll see that bit by bit, you can perfect yourself. Jesus gave it as a commandment. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. Now, the average translator, incapable of absorbing that thing literally, says be good just as God is good, or be something or other, but perfect. They can't swallow that word because it would cut out an awful lot of things that they consider necessary to their own comfort, like being selfish and greedy and whatever else. There's always that compromise. That's why it's so important to have masters come down and give it to you straight. Boy, living with Master was by no means, some people say how wonderful it was to live with him, how wonderful it must have been to live with him. It certainly was. But boy, it was not easy, because he held up a goal for you that I remember one time, because the subconscious rebels, and I just had it, I'd had it for a while with all this meditation and chanting and meditating. And I remember just stretching out on my bed and reading Shakespeare. Now that may seem pretty ridiculous to you, but for me it was absolute luxury. I loved Shakespeare, and I never had a chance to do anything but listen to these Indian chants. But bit by bit, living with Master, sure, it was not easy. I remember one time there was a bar mitzvah, and we were invited to show yoga postures, and I was never particularly good at the postures until I had to do them with a group of others in front of Master for a guest. And in Master's presence, I suddenly found I could do them all perfectly. And so much so that they always called on me to demonstrate the postures. Completely unearned glory. But so they had me showing these postures at this bar mitzvah in Beverly Hills. Well, there were all these Jewish psychiatrists and people very intellectual. And this one absolute skeptic came afterwards and was grilling me. And I thought I'd really give it to him. And I told him some miracles I'd experienced with Master. Well, I was dumb enough and naive enough to think that that would impress him. Sure, I'm sure it did. He was probably thinking, now where can I fit him in my appointment book? He was not impressed in the way I wanted him to be impressed. He was probably only impressed with my total lack of balance and sanity. Anyway, I saw Master a couple of days later, and because I often would serve lunch for people when he had guests, and then I would sometimes do the postures and so on. And then after they left, he would sit and we'd talk for a while. And so we were sitting there and talking, and he looked at me and he said, by the way, when you're with skeptics, don't talk about miracles. And I said, oh, you know. I was amazed that he would know this. His answer amazed me even more. He said, I know every thought you think. He didn't say it with that tone of voice. He said, I know every thought you think. I'm giving it the emphasis because, boy, that's an emphatic statement. And he showed it again and again. There was one time, most of his training was to help me to become a good teacher in public. And so there was one time, one of the men in the church in Hollywood, who was, I didn't think very highly of him because he's flattered. And I mentioned to him that I was going to be giving the talk on Thursday. So he said, well, I'll be sure to be there then. Well, I didn't want to accept that. I knew he'd be there anyway. And this then business, as if, well, because you're coming, I didn't want to accept that flattery. It was meaningless. So my way of fending it off was totally without any grace at all. I said, well, then would you please stand at the front door and check people's pockets for vegetables? And Master, after another of these lunches, was sitting with me and he said, oh, by the way, don't talk about vegetables. But again and again he showed his sensitivity to every nuance of thought that I had. And I thought, my gosh, it's not that he's sitting there concentrating, Walter. He had hundreds of disciples. And he must have been doing that with all of them. How is it possible for one person to have a consciousness that is in so many minds? And yet he did have. It was an absolutely wonderful experience, but by no means easy, because he didn't let you get away with any excuse. God first, God all the time. And it was something that you'd think, oh, what a blessing to just bask in that. Yeah, it was a great blessing to bask in it when you were basking. Otherwise, there were other times when he could be severe. I loved it. That's why I survived. There were others who couldn't take it and didn't survive. And so, living with the Master is challenging to you. He challenges your own higher self. It isn't that he was a martinet. He was holding yourself up to yourself. That's why an amazing thing, and I think I mentioned this last year when I was here, that I could never remember what he looked like. I lived with him. I see one of you and I can remember your faces months later. I couldn't remember his. I had to see a photograph to concentrate on him. Why? Because his face was always changing. It wasn't as if, well, there's this personality. The truth is there wasn't any personality, really. It was all God. As he said, I killed Yogananda long ago. No one lives in this temple now but God. That's really how it seemed. I couldn't ever fail to feel that I was in the presence of God when I was with him. It was an amazing thing. He treated it lightly. I remember one time I was in a sleeping bag on the floor at the monks' retreat in 29 Palms, and all of a sudden I woke up and I felt as if God himself was in the room. And I meditated, and then I looked out the window and I saw that Master was walking up and down outside, and I came out and he blessed me. But later he made a joke of it. He said, oh, I thought you were a ghost. But he was very light about these things. It's not as if he said, lo, I say so-and-so. When he did make predictions sometimes, but it was always, as I put it in The Path, my autobiography, he wore his wisdom like a comfortable old jacket. It was just an amazing experience being with him. He wasn't even humble. He was more than humble. He was non-existent. It was just God talking through him. But what he gave you was always right for you. And an example that I think I mentioned a year ago was a wonderful example. 2 photographs. One where he was standing next to the President of Mexico. His name was Portes Gil, and portly describes him, apart from the name Portes. He was big like this. And Master was standing next to him, and he looked just like Portes Gil. Well, you could think, okay, well, he was robust. He was, actually. But the astounding thing was the other photograph that I pair with that in my mind was of Amelita Galli-Curci. Galli-Curci was a very famous opera singer, sort of almost on the level of Caruso, and wonderful. She became his disciple. But he was standing next to her, and she was old at the time and frail and thin. And darned if Master didn't look old, frail, and thin. He didn't. The same features, the same everything. What I realized was that it's his consciousness. that he had the consciousness of Portiskil, the consciousness of Galikurchi, the consciousness of everybody he was with. He was like a flawless mirror. He became you, in a sense, your own higher self. That doesn't mean that if you were angry, he would show anger. What he would show rather was your potential. If you were angry, he would show your potential for calm, for not, anger comes from frustrated desire. He had no desires. And he showed you how without desires, you're not going to be affected by anything. It won't matter to you anymore. He showed you in subtle ways that only your own deeper consciousness could recognize. I remember one time I was in a group of people in the church. He said something in passing that related to me in a way that only I would know it. And I felt in my mind very grateful to him. And he looked at me with a smile and went on. He caught it, he knew it, he'd intended it for me, but then he went on. I remember at Symphony Hall in Boston, which I don't know how many hundreds of people it houses, but it was full. And one of the monks there, Oliver Rogers, he became Brother Devananda later, and he was there at that lecture, and then for many years he lost sight of Master, wondered where he was, and went through all sorts of different churches and so on, trying to find what he was looking for, until finally he found Master, and then at the age of 55 he became a monk there and so on. Well, I remember him saying to Master, all the time during your lecture at Symphony Hall, you just kept looking at me. And Master said, I remember. Imagine thousands of people. That kind of memory, that kind of soul recognition is something you don't get. He was a fantastic person to be with, but easy to live with, not so easy. Challenging, thrilling, wonderful, all of the above. But he really challenged you to put out your effort. I remember I was playing a game of chess with a friend, and Master asked where we were, and somebody said they're playing chess. What a waste of time. Well, I do like chess. I haven't played it for many years because he said that, but he never let down from that high goal. Yet I remember that there was a time when my mind was in absolute rebellion, and he said, don't worry about it. The mind is like a donkey. There are times when the donkey, no matter how you beat it, will just stay firm and won't move. The thing to do then is let it stand, and after a while it'll start moving of its own accord. So he knew these things too. It wasn't as if he was just constantly driving you. He understood that the mind is like fishing. You have to let the fish go for a while, and then pull it back, then let it go for a while. Finally it tires out and you can reel it in. And so with the mind, and so with his discipline. Well, anyway, what these masters have come to do is to show us how to become like them. It's not to keep us little. It's not to keep us just students. All masters come to show us that our potential is what they give us, what they show us. Whatever they are, we must become. And we should not feel satisfied until we can achieve that goal. I remember I had some, to me, wonderful experiences spiritually, and I mentioned to Master. He said, that's nothing. He didn't say it to discourage me. He said it not for me not to get stuck in some little realization. It doesn't mean anything. Don't be satisfied with anything but the greatest. Well, what a different outlook. What a different approach to human nature from that of Freud, Karl Marx, Darwin, Malthus, Adam Smith, etc., etc. I took those because they're prominent, but there are so many thinkers who have been writing in that way. And yes, I know there have been others. Henry David Thoreau and Emerson were two of my favorite authors before I came to Master. And they were great souls, but they don't represent the mainstream of Western thinking. And that's why I ignored them and concentrated on these mainstream ones who have influenced the influencers, you might say. Well, let's begin just briefly at the beginning. Copernicus didn't write a book, but he did make a discovery that has had far-reaching impact on our whole culture. Because he discovered that the world is not the center of the universe. That's what everybody thought it was. Now you just wonder how they ever thought that the world was flat. You go out to sea and you see a ship approaching you and you see it coming up out of the horizon. You don't see it getting bigger and bigger from a small dot. You suddenly see its mast and then the rest of it, and finally the whole ship is there. Well, what makes the ocean curve? You'd have thought that people would have figured that one out with all the thousands of people who went to sea. Nobody did until a certain time. Mind you, these thoughts were well known in antiquity. The Greeks knew that the world is round. Columbus didn't come upon this thought by accident. It was an old tradition that he was resurrecting and saying that the world is flat. Now I've got to tell you a joke. A white person asked an American Indian, do you prefer to be called American Indians or Native Americans? And the Indian said, well, since we're neither, we're just grateful that Columbus wasn't looking for turkey. Anyway, the consciousness of mankind, Sri Yukteswar explained it. He said that the energy rays coming to the earth at that time weren't sufficient to produce the kind of understanding that is normal today. Nowadays, just about anybody can say, well, of course the world is round. Then, and it isn't just our education, there's so many things that support that. The understanding that is widespread today was absolutely not even a fantasy in those days, because the whole human race was subject to less energy from the universe. And I'm not going to go in the details of it, but if you don't know the explanation of Sri Yukteswar, Yogananda's guru, it's in his book, The Holy Science. It's also in Yogananda's autobiography, and we at Ananda put out a number of things about that. But we're in a new age, in fact, literally, not just figuratively. And with this new age, we've come to understand things that in those days they would have thought was absolute madness. You know, when I was a boy only, I mean, I'm old, but I'm not ancient. When I was a boy, a teacher in school in England told me that they have found out that all the stars that we see are one galaxy, and that they call them nebulae at the time, but they aren't nebulae. Now we know that nebulae and galaxy are different terms. And he said they've even discovered that there are 2 or maybe even 3 other galaxies like this one. And I was amazed, 2 or 3 galaxies. Well, you know, in this short space of time, they've discovered that there are something like 100 billion galaxies. Incredible. The Hubble telescope took a little view of space about an inch across. It showed billions of galaxies right in that tiny little space. Is crawling with things. And I think it's pretty dumb to think that all those things can be there without thinking people. That's another subject that I may come into later. But here we are in a universe so vast. What is the result that people have taken from that? Copernicus, people were so upset with Copernicus, blaming, they blame the messenger, shoot the messenger. He was only telling people what he saw. Shooting him or crucifying him or persecuting him wouldn't change what he saw. This has been human nature since the beginning. But it didn't work. Galileo came on, Kepler came on, Tycho Brahe came on, other great astronomers came and showed that the world really is round. And the world, they thought then that the sun is the center of the whole universe. Toward the end of the 19th century, they still thought the sun was the center of the universe. How far we've come from there, and what has it done to human thinking? Well, the first thing people have taken from that is from thinking that man was all important and the whole universe was created for man, they came to the decision that this means man is absolutely has no meaning at all, no purpose, no direction. And of course it's led to other kinds of philosophy like that of Sartre and other nihilists who say that therefore to think that there are any kinds of values that are anything but subjective is foolish, meaningless, that moral truths are non-existent, just whatever you think. Sartre wrote plays and philosophy to try to demonstrate that anything you think, if you think it sincerely, then it's true for you. Well, he made such a clever case of it. The guy was a complete imposter philosophically. Everything he wrote was based on a false premise. For example, his basic premise was that, now what was it? Now my mind has been off that and I've got to get back into it to think. Really writing and trying to put myself in tune with these people has been a bit of a test. But he said that, yes, here it is, that
That man is radically free?
That's it, thank you. He said man is radically free. That was his premise. Well, on the basis of that, he went through this long thing and finally said, and therefore man is radically free. Well, you can't fly a flag from a flagpole that isn't there. If you're going to say man is radically free, you can't make that a basic assumption, you've got to prove it. And he didn't. He used that to, because we're radically free, therefore we can do anything we like. Well, I say to that, okay, why not eat nails? You can't. Why can't you? Because you can't invent the rules governing your physical body. And the same thing is true morally. You can't be selfish, grasping, cruel, and just say, well, I choose to make that my value and therefore I thrive under that. You won't thrive. Why? Because it goes against the way our nature was made. Nature imposes upon us, if nothing else, the consciousness of wanting to expand our territory, expand our knowledge, expand our sympathies, expand everything. And anything that contracts that goes against that nature. Suffering is always a relative thing. If you go to the poor people in some parts of the world, our assumption is that they're miserable. If they come to you and know that you can give them something, they'll put on this show of misery. As you know, I grew up in Romania, and I remember in Bucharest, the gypsies, seeing us going to the skating rink as children, came up to us, "Nu am mâncat pentru 3 zile, I haven't eaten for 3 days." And so we gave them something, and we went in and skated. And when we came out, we saw them laughing and playing and having a great time. And as soon as they saw us, nu am mâncat pentru 3. But the fact is that human nature is such that it can adjust itself. There's an absolutely wonderful passage in the autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, who was a great sculptor and silver worker and so on in medieval Italy. And he did things that the Pope had assigned him to do. And he wanted to be paid, and the Pope wouldn't pay him. And finally the Pope, who had all the muscle, put him in prison. And he was there in this dungeon with enough. He had a wet mattress, damp mattress, because it was underground. A dungeon, in fact. Rats running over the floor. The usual classical bread and water. And enough light from the window to be able to read the Bible 1 hour a day only. What could he do? He had nothing else. He spent the time praying. You know what he wrote afterwards, and the Pope finally gave in and let him out? He wrote, saying, if you want to know what real happiness is, arrange to be put in prison, arrange to have all these deprivations, and read the Bible and pray. He said, I felt so much bliss as I've never felt in my life. Now, human nature can adjust. The important thing is that whatever we have, we suffer if we have less. You have a painting. Maybe it's precious to you. Some little child comes in and spills acid on it and ruins it. You suffer. Why should you suffer? You were perfectly happy before you got the painting. Why suffer? It's because you have less. Or when you got the painting, oh boy, but you've got it. You're no different from what you were before. It's that thought of expansion, that thought of acquisition, that thought of more, as opposed to thinking less. Suffering comes with diminution of consciousness, shrinking of consciousness. Joy comes with expansion. And so you get your $1 million you were looking for, and you live with that happily until you discover a cousin of yours has several times as much, and then you're unhappy again until you can get as much as he had. It's all in the mind. Finally, you reach the point where you just know that happiness is something inside you. There's that beautiful story of King Alexander the so-called Great, and Diogenes, who they say lived in a tub. I find this hard to understand, but maybe tub had a different meaning in Greek, I don't know. But that's what they say. And he was sitting there, and Alexander had heard about this great wise man. So he came and he said, I would love to do for you anything that you would like me to, anything I can. What can I do for you? And he said, yes, you can do one thing for me. You're standing in such a way that you're blocking the sun out. If you would just move a few feet to the right, I'll be in the sunshine. That's all he wanted. You reach the point where you just don't care. What does it matter? You see wealthy people, and usually they're less happy than poor people. Many poor people are very happy once they get used to their state. And it doesn't mean no, so let's make everybody poor. To be St. Francis nowadays would be a unnecessary and useless lesson. People who love St. Francis think, well, why don't you go in sackcloth? What kind of lesson would it give? Who would listen to him? It's not what people are ready for. A certain amount of good, a certain amount of money, a certain amount of prosperity is in fact a spiritual thing. It's not that in itself that is contrary to spirituality. It's attachment to these things that is contrary. When Master was in New York one time, he went to Radio City Music Hall, and he paid his admission. He said, now I own the building. And he enjoyed this building and enjoyed looking around and so on. Finally, when he was ready to leave, he gave the building back to the people. We can do that with the world. Why do you have to own it and you're right? Just enjoy what you have and leave it in God's hands. So much more freedom with that. Well, Copernicus brought people to this consciousness that we have no value at all, that all is, it's all just whatever you think is right. Well, in fact, as you analyze it carefully, you see that there are universal values. And there isn't a religion or a religious teacher of any value in the world who has ever said, my children, for a change, tell lies, steal from each other. They don't. They all give basically the same principles. You don't find anybody, you don't find Buddhists saying we should practice Christian humility. They say practice humility. Why attach a label to these things? Jesus didn't. It's his disciples who do. Buddha didn't. It's his disciples that do. It's the disciples that fight. But the masters are probably all up there having tea and enjoying the scene, enjoying the comedy down here. The thing that Copernicus gave us was something that we need to understand more carefully. Because once you've understood how vast this universe is, then you realize there's really not even a center to this universe. And so you come back to another teaching of science, which is that the atom is the key to the universe. Understand the atom, you've understood everything. More than that, because consciousness is a part of it. Understand individual man, and you've understood all humanity, you've understood everything. That's why the ancients And the Greeks also with their saying, gnotis auton, know thyself. The more you can know yourself, you are the center of the whole universe. And in fact, where you are right now is where everything else begins. I thought it the other day, I was thinking it would be fun to write a play, sort of surreal, in which, first of all, one person is the central character, and everybody else is asleep. And he talks to somebody, they wake up, and they start talking, and then they fall asleep again. And he's the whole show. Then he drops out, and somebody else gets up, and he's the center. And each one in turn is the center, and you and everybody else flops down. But that's how it is. You see somebody for a few days, and then he's gone, and he ceases to exist, maybe. With email, it's harder to think that way. But bit by bit, you realize that you'll never understand anything except beginning with your understanding. And if you can see it that way, ultimately, it doesn't matter what all these socialistic theories are, sociological theories are, philosophies are. It all comes back to you, your understanding, your needs. From that, you can understand. Now, there's another and very important aspect of this truth, and that is that everybody, you are center as Master put it in the autobiography, center everywhere, circumference nowhere is the way divine vision is. But that means you are that, and you are that, and you are that. Each one of you is the center of the universe. It isn't as if I'm the center of the universe, bow down. No. Each one is. And if you want to gain mastery, you don't gain control over other people. Master taught us that lesson because he never was a master of anyone but himself. But with that, and with that magnetism, you know that from his center, he also could live at the center of each one of us. He was us. You, if you want to understand anything, will not get it by sweating and hitting the books for exams. You will get it by being more and more deeply in tune with yourself. And from that, you'll understand other people just instinctively, because they too are manifestations of that same divine reality. It isn't your ego. It isn't my ego. It's the divine that has become all these different tiny points in space. It's an inconceivable view of reality because our minds are used to thinking outwardly. We like to think in terms of I own this property, I own this bank account, I own these friends, etc. It's altogether different. From your center, you can only really have mastery over the universe to the extent that you can empathize, not control. That ability to go from your center to others is the secret of creative work. That if you, for example, want to write a piece of music, don't think in terms of I've got to write a piece of music. Think in terms of what am I trying to express, and how will that, at the core of that melody that I want, try to bring it out from its own core. When you look at other people, don't do what Sartre said, which is that when you see another, you see that which you are not. Do it the way Jesus said. He said, love your neighbor as yourself. He meant it literally. Because when you look at others and feel, this is myself, in that form. It was so sweet one time, we were helping Master into the car because he was having trouble with his legs. And he said, you also are so kind to me with your many attentions. And we said, sir, it's you who are kind to us. What else could you possibly think? But his answer was so sweet. He said, God is helping God. That's his drama. And it's really all these points of divine consciousness helping each other. The more you can bring it to that level of awareness where you see that that same inner self is a part of yourself. As Master one time looked at somebody, he said, you have a sour taste in your mouth, don't you? The man said, well, how'd you know? Master said, because I'm as much in your body as I am in this body. This is the consciousness we need to develop, because you'll notice that the more sensitive a human being is, the more evolved spiritually, whatever, the more he naturally becomes that way. He doesn't have to study the psychology and the workings and all that. He just becomes that. When you can understand that everything you'll ever know begins at your center, and everything you'll ever control becomes a matter of your center relating with empathy to other centers. Life begins that way. God didn't sit up there in the clouds saying, all right, tree, I'm going to make you like this. Wayne, I'm going to make you like that. Christy, I'm going to make you like this. No. God became you. And from inside, if you cut a tree at the trunk, you'll see it all grows from inside out. There are the rings gradually spreading out. But when Pygmalion made that statue of this beautiful woman, she was so beautiful he fell in love with her. And according to the legend, he prayed to Aphrodite, and Aphrodite materialized, made her alive, and she became the woman Galatea. This is what every artist would like, but he can't do it. Why? Because he makes it from outside in. Anything you do from outside in, be it a statue or a painting or a book or a piece of music or whatever you do, if you do it from the outside in, it will always be a lifeless form. I was amazed in Switzerland, in the park in Lugano. There was a statue of Socrates, you know, when he took the hemlock and died. Well, this is a dramatic moment in history, and I would say that a decent artist would have started with the thought of what was going through his mind when he took that hemlock. Was it courage? Was it faith? Was it dedication to duty? Was it a joy transcendent above death itself? So many attitudes could have been expressed in that statue. You know what they had? They had him slumped on the chair after taking the hemlock. A lifeless body, and this was Socrates. He was no more wise as a corpse than you are will be as a corpse. This is what you see in modern art today. So much of it is from outside in, and there's no life in it, because they think that if they just come up with some new form, they'll be creating great art. It wasn't form that made Leonardo great. It wasn't form that made Michelangelo great. It wasn't form that's produced the great art in this world. It's people who are sensitive enough to be able to feel that thing from inside. And you'll notice that there are some people in business. Because mind you, I talk about art, music, those are my own particular predilection, background, whatever you want to say. But it's true everywhere. There's some people who succeed in business over all possible odds because they know inside, they have a feeling, they have an attunement with their subject. Karma comes into it too. I remember a friend of mine's father, he lived up in Wellesley Hills, and he had advised a number of people in business investments and so on, and they became millionaires. But he couldn't become rich himself. He didn't have the karma. No matter how he tried, for himself it didn't work. For everybody else it did work. Well, that's karma. You can't really change that very easily. But the fact remains that anybody who is really good in whatever his field might be, and it could be the most simple thing. Mind you, in God's eyes, there's nothing greater about the outwardly great things that human beings recognize as great. And the simple little, I remember I worked in a sintering plant upstate New York before I finally discovered Master. And the man there was teaching me how to sweep the ashes off a step. And he did it with great skill. Whatever you do it with skill, do it with consciousness. I was very impressed. I never got the hang of it. But just the simple way of twisting the broom and so on, sure, it's not, it doesn't take genius to do that, But nonetheless, whatever you've got, if you do it with this consciousness, you can really accomplish things that are right for you, and that's all that matters. In God's eyes, there's no great or small. There's only right or relatively wrong. So with that understanding that we need to understand the universe from inside out, that's how I built Ananda. I didn't think in terms of solar energy or how are we going to get this done and what kind of a setup. All the utopian books I've ever read talk about the system. I said people are going to corrupt any system, even the best system if they're corrupt. And even the worst system, if they're good people, they'll somehow help it to bumble along. I remember the comment of somebody from Austria who visited Ananda village. I hope we're a little better now, but when he came, he said, I just don't know how they succeed at anything. There's chaos. But he said, somehow everything works. And that's the point. There was goodwill. And where there's goodwill, things do work. So that the secret of communities is obvious. People. But they're the one thing that are sort of overlooked in the whole thing. They assume that if you get a perfect system, the system will make perfect people. No system has ever made people anything, except if they had the goodwill to become that. And if they did, it didn't matter what system you had. Now, I don't mean to take it to the extreme, therefore no system. Sure, it's good to have system, it's good to be efficient. We do our best in that way, but we know that's not the secret. The secret is human beings. Train them in right attitudes, train them in devotion, and you'll find that everything will work out. I'm saying this to you all here because we'd love to get something started here in this place to get a real community going on the East Coast. But if you can understand that simple principle that Copernicus, with his discovery, everybody went bang down the wrong trail, and then bit by bit we see how, no, it is people that matter. Every point in the universe is the center of the universe. Center everywhere, circumference nowhere. Well, if you go down the list of all these different famous writers, you see that the same has been true in each case. That Machiavelli wrote Il Principe, the Prince. And I'm sure that many of you know him, but thank God they don't teach him very much anymore in the West. They certainly teach him in Italy, but none of them like him. How could you? His whole purpose was to show people how to gain and hold absolute control, ruthlessly as you want to, whatever will gain that control. And I stepped back a moment and I said, well, let's look at the results of this teaching. Every single person who accepted that teaching and lived by it, he did gain success for a certain time, then his life was a disaster. Adolf Hitler kept a copy of his book by his bedside. He was greatly successful until he committed suicide. Mussolini considered it the best thing in the world until he finally he had the subtlety to understand that people would realize what he was really doing. So he banned Machiavelli, but not before admitting that it was the best book for a dictator available. Napoleon, they found a copy of his book at Waterloo in his carriage. Again and again, you find that these great, so-called great dictators, when it all came down to the final wire, their lives were a disaster. And so you just have to say that their system didn't really work. Now then, what does this mean? It means that we need to ask of each of these people, does it work or doesn't it? Plato's system didn't work. Sound good on paper. It maybe sounds good to some people. To me it sounds grotesque. But nonetheless, some people may think so. Talk about it for ages, for 2,000 years. They've discussed it in university classes. But you take that simple example of the fact that when he was invited by the king of Syracuse to put his ideas into practice, the whole thing was a fiasco. Well, if it doesn't work, then why keep talking about it? But you'll find that in every one of these cases, there's just something wrong. Adam Smith is a very good example. Thank you. I think that the whole idea of Adam Smith, free enterprise, I do think that's essential. But he put it on the level of cutthroat competition, everyone working only for himself. And what we need to do then is ask the question. I said this to some of you yesterday. You weren't all here, so I'll repeat it. It bears repetition. He gave at least one example, and it was at least he brought it down to something concrete. He said the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and so on, they're not in business to help you. They're in business to help themselves. A baker doesn't bake bread because you need bread. He bakes bread because your need for bread is going to be income for himself. And people were absolutely outraged at this thought because they'd been brought up on the so-called Christian ethic that self-denial is moral. Well, I don't see why self-denial is going to be something anybody really embraces sincerely. I think of Buddhism in this light. The goal of Buddhists, if you look at their philosophy, is a level of enlightenment, so-called, that cancels you out completely. You cease to exist. And I read this in an official document in Thailand. I don't know if all Buddhists think this way. I'm not looking for absolutes. I'm giving examples of absolutes that are principles. But it said that in the beginning, because it was confronting the Indian teaching of Satchidanandam, existence, consciousness, bliss, and they conceded that yes, there is a moment of bliss when you attain nirvana and then nothing. Well, let me ask you, who in this world could ever be expected to work sincerely to achieve nothingness? Cancellation of everything? There's something in you that says, wait a minute, I want to at least be aware of that nothingness. I don't want to just cease to exist. Some people jump off bridges with that goal in mind, but basically people who are seeking truth aren't thinking of committing suicide, and yet this is the supreme suicide, beyond which there's no redemption. There's nothing left. So as a result, Buddhists are working very hard to avoid becoming a spider the next lifetime, or a poor person and maybe becoming a little bit happier or whatever. But they're always looking for further lives instead of the goal of all spiritual striving, which is annihilation of the ego self in order to attain the infinite self. Well, self-denial in itself is not worth it. It doesn't give you anything. It's negative. Why should I help you if I know that by trying to help you, I'm going to go to hell? I doubt very much you'd see me here. It would be foolish to expect Jesus to have lived his life and taught people if the end of it was only crucifixion. He didn't do it only for others. He did it because his own fulfillment came in serving others. We have to realize, therefore, and this is what I mention in my book, that in fact, Smith didn't go far enough. He talked about the baker. Okay, so let's take his example. But let's take two bakers in town. One of them, as I mentioned in the book, William Baker, his name is, and he's only interested in grabbing for himself whatever money his customers are willing to shell out. But there's another baker in town whose name is Joe Crumpet. And Joe Crumpet enjoys his work, he enjoys his customers. He's also in business for himself. That's why he has a shop. But he's sharing with them. There's a certain sense of the pleasure of having customers come into his store. He asks after your wife or your husband or your children. He talks about his products. Do you like this? Would you like me to make it differently? He's thinking of including your fulfillment, happiness, whatever, in his own. Well, now you put yourself in your own shoes there and ask yourself, to whom will you go? To this guy with ulcers and a dour face? Or to this guy who greets you with a friendly smile, who makes you feel you're his friend? I don't think you need to even be asked that question personally. I don't need for a show of hands. How many want to go to William Baker? Everybody would go to Joe Crumpet. Seems obvious. And another thing, supposing this Baker, William Baker, supposing he faces some real tragedy. His house burns down, his wife dies, his child comes down with some fatal disease. Won't you forget your feeling of antipathy for him instinctively and try to help him? Why? Not because you think, well, he makes better bread. No, because he's a fellow human being. These are universal things. We find more fulfillment when we seek self-fulfillment in an expansive self, not a contractive self. It's as simple as that. Your little point of the universe, that is your point of origin, your point of reality, the only thing you can ever know, really, until you expand it and realize that that same self is in all these other atoms. When you can do that, then you find a fulfillment that is really self-fulfilling. And the more you think in terms of taking, the more unhappy you are. And now supposing you have, to take your example, because Leon was talking about competition. He said in communities, what if they're in so many communities that they sort of get in each other's way, all of them trying to do the same thing? Won't competition enter the picture there? Well, no, it needn't, because everybody has something he can give that nobody else can give. If nothing else, himself. Not everybody will like you. Not everybody will like what you do. There's one woman who's a friend of mine who writes me every now and then saying, I don't know why, I just don't like you. So I think, okay, that's your problem. I like her, but she'll never be my follower. It doesn't matter. She goes some other direction. There are plenty of, some people like sugar, some people like chocolate. It doesn't matter. We all like sweetness. That's what counts. So there's no need for competition. But the thing is, supposing Baker and Crumpet lived next door to each other, they're likely to have a very interesting influence on each other. First of all, Baker, with his selfish attitude, sees that everybody's going to Crumpet, nobody's going to him. At first he's going to probably try to pass a law or get excited in some way, try to put down this thing, yeah, he may be okay, but his bread isn't as good as mine, or who knows what. He'll try to have a competitive attitude to cut the other guy down and build himself up. Bit by bit, however, he'll start to think, well, why are they going to him? Maybe I need to be. And he may not rationalize this, but somehow, over a period of time, you'll see him begin to smile. He'll realize this is the better way to get along with people. And he won't think of his customers as just opportunities for himself. He'll think of them as opportunities to expand himself. And so Crumpet will have a good influence on Baker. And Baker may have a good influence on Crumpet, because Baker will give Crumpet the subtler kind of sensitivity that comes with knowing that the reason this guy is so sour-faced is that he's got a wife who is always sick. He's got problems at home that are really nagging at him. It may have nothing to do with his personality. It may have to do with many other things. So Crumpet will become more sympathetic, more insightful. Each will help the other. We could think of it as these two people in fierce competition, or we could think of it in terms of each helping the other. This is how we need to learn to think. Well, here I am. Hour and a half into my talk, more or less. Really, theoretically, an hour and a half. Actually, an hour and 10 minutes, but never mind. When we go a little further into this book, we see, yes, I said Machiavelli, that there's no happiness in there. Adam Smith, he's right, but he just isn't right enough, that's all. And that's what I found with each one of them. They aren't right enough. They aren't asking the right questions. And if we can take what they've given us, the legacy they've given us, and just understand it in a little bit different way, ask the right questions, we suddenly find that, yes, this is a great heritage we have. You know, one of the wonderful things about the West is its use of logic. You'll find that logic in the West is something that we're trained to, we're accustomed to it. There's a story of a pundit in India who said to a Western archaeologist, you know, in all the excavations they have done in India, they have not discovered a single wire. This proves that they had the wireless. Well, you look at that kind of thinking and say it doesn't prove anything. But you do find levels of illogic in India, not from lack of intelligence. They're highly intelligent people, but they hadn't been trained in our kind of logic, which is a very good thing. It's just that we need to learn to keep it in its place. And when it jumps up and tries to get in your lap and lick your face, you say, down, boy. Don't be too much intrusive, because there's room for something much more. The heart can understand things the mind will never understand. When I've written music, I've understood instantly that I have to feel it. And if I feel it, I know it's right. And I can't give you a single reason why it's right. But later I can give you reasons. Then reason comes in and can analyze it. For example, here's a very interesting illustration. I wrote a song called Cloisters. Long I've called you, my Lord, long I've called you. Many years I have longed for your sight. What is it? Huh?
Bathed the darkness.
Prayed?
Bathed the darkness.
Bathe, what is it? Bathe the...
darkness with tears.
Oh, that's it. You see my own song. Bathed the darkness with tears of devotion, offered candles in prayer to your light. How much longer, friend, must I call your name? I am yours, ever yours. Will you come? That's a simple melody. The only real logical thought I had at the beginning was that it was 4 slides of a monastery in Sorrento in Italy. But it's a monastery that is not a monastery anymore. It's a tourist attraction. So I couldn't have only a monastic feeling. I had to capture the feeling you get when you go there, which is intermingled with tourist vibrations and consciousness and so on. So, but I didn't think it through. I sort of had that thought, and then I held it up to, you might say, the inner light, the inner consciousness. And then this melody came, and it was just built into the need right then. You'll see that your inspiration comes if the heart's in tune. The first thing is naturally Gregorian style music. Long I've called you, my Lord, long I've called you. That's very Gregorian in feeling. Many years I have longed for your sight. You want to repeat that to make it clear that's what you mean. But then you want to get away from that. Now, what would natural songwriting do in Western style if you wanted to depart from that? The next line would have to be, how much longer, friend? Wouldn't it be? It wouldn't work. That would be emotional. You'd lose power with that emotion. So you have to say, you have to rein in the emotion. How much longer, friend, must I call your name? You see, held in, it's much more powerful. With the other, you would blast it out, be all emotional, but there would be no power left. It would be sort of sprayed to the winds. But how much longer, friend, must I call your name? And then the end, you can't end it the way classical Western music demands, which is that you go back to the tonic. It would be, I am yours, ever yours, will you come? You'd have it ended, a full stop. At the end, when your words and mood are intending to take you out to infinity, you can't end on the tonic. So naturally, these are things I rationalized later and realized that this is what my heart was saying. But I didn't understand it at the time. I just felt this is how it has to be. But I am yours, ever yours, will you come? See, it takes you out into infinity. Well, everything we do, if we don't get the reason involved too much and try to feel it from our heart, we can see how this should be. That statue of Socrates didn't do that. He just tried to implant his own thought on it, and let's see, I'll do something nobody else has done. I'll show him dead. Well, what did it do? Originality, as I said yesterday, isn't doing something new and different. It's doing something that comes from your own insight. I saw a slideshow made by some company in Germany of the Holy Land, and it showed the Mount of Transfiguration where Jesus appeared and was transfigured before his disciples, and they understood who he was on a deeper spiritual level. Now, what does all this imagery give you? Something that takes you up to infinity, to the sky. It was on top of a mountain. That reinforces that image. So I could just see the mentality of the photographer who said, well, everybody's done that. Let me do something different. So he rented a helicopter, got above the mountain and shot down upon the mountain so that it looked like a little mushroom. Didn't give you any message at all. It was ridiculous. But he was implanting his own originality. To me, that's not originality, that's ego. To be truly original means to leave the ego out of it. What does God through me want to say right now? That's different. The more you can work from that self, God has a song to sing through every human being, through every atom. That, I think, is why the ancient Greeks spoke of the music of the spheres. There's a music coming out of everything. If you could listen to it, listen more to that. Listen to Om in meditation. You'll see that's what will transform your consciousness. Now, I've taken this talk far from as much as I'd like to, but I'm not going to take it further, because then we get into Darwin, Freud, Karl Marx, things that are subject to themselves. But basically what I wanted to do in this book was show that no big system is going to do it. You can't impose a system on people because we're all really unique, really so. God is special in each one of us. You can't demand that everybody go in lockstep together, togetherness toward anything. You have to have some sort of approach, some sort of philosophy that respects the individual for who he is. And this means not imposing, but inviting. Now, communism is a very interesting example, because Karl Marx had this big theory that he wanted to impose on the whole world. In order to impose this theory, it's sort of like Procrustes' bed. You know the story of Procrustes? He was the sort of evil man in ancient Greece that Theseus visited. And Procrustes entertained him like a honored guest and invited him to sleep in his bed. Well, Theseus realized what he was doing. This special bed was such that if you were too long for it, he would just cut your legs off, strap you down so you couldn't move, cut your legs out and laughingly leave you to bleed to death. And if you were too short for the bed, he had some sort of gadget that would stretch your body to the point where you were long enough for the bed. And so you died in agony. And if you were right for the bed, I don't know what he did. But Theseus slew the man and destroyed his despotry, or despotism, whichever the word is. And actually many of those old Greek myths are very deep philosophical allegories. This is what people do with reason. If what I want to be true doesn't fit my theory, I'll just change it a little bit. Like one of the English architects was studying Crete, and he found a layer of pottery or something on a particular level that shouldn't have been according to his theory. So he sort of looked around and moved it to where it ought to have been according to his theory. There's a lot of that goes on, where they try to adjust the outward reality to fit the theory. And many people in communism and other social theories have done the same. So what have the communists done? Killed 100 million of their own people. In Cambodia, they killed, what was it, a third of their population. I know when I visited Cambodia in 1958, it really felt to me as if there was a dark cloud over that country. I just felt there's something they're going to have to suffer. But the theory is not enough. You've got to go with facts. Does it work? Now with communities, we don't have to say everybody has to do it. Those who want to try it, invite them. Don't force them to stay. Let them leave if they want to. But bit by bit, with a community, you have a further opportunity, a chance to fine-tune, a chance to adjust. You have certain expectations, but if they don't work, drop it. Many times in Ananda's growth, we've seen this happen, that where we expected one thing to work, but people weren't ready for it, or whatever. In fact, years ago, people used to ask me how I saw the future of Ananda. When I told them, they were scared to death. They didn't want anything that big. But I knew it would happen. It's happened. And I'm not going to tell you more, but it will be much more. Because this is the nature of things. When you've got a good thing, people see it and they say, oh, I'm glad you're doing something nice. Hey, wait a minute, maybe I should do that. And pretty soon you've got more and more people deciding that this is the way to live. I have to say that I've lived in Ananda, well, all its existence, 34 years. Every day I just think how wonderful it is to live here. People say, thank you for building Ananda. I just say, thank you, God, for making Ananda possible. Because Ananda is really, it's not paradise, it's not perfect. I think one of the greatest mistakes we make, one of the greatest lessons we have to live, to learn in life, is that you can't expect people to be perfect. You have to accept that there are going to be differences of understanding. Welcome them instead of rejecting them. Don't imagine that everybody has to agree on anything, but offer. And more, if a thing is good, if it works, people get on the bandwagon. That's the only way we can change this world. We're not we're not going to do it by creating new theories, social or whatever else. We're not going to do it by imposing anything. And I suspect that Washington and Adams and all those old people, if they look back now, I bet they're somewhat disappointed. There are things that must have made them turn in their graves that we just take, like, frankly, no prayer in the schools. When they founded it on spiritual principles, with the justification that we shouldn't confuse church and state, which I agree, and they said we shouldn't. But we've gone so far away from their original spirit, it's painful. Why is there so much suicide among the young? Because we're giving them nothing to believe in. And if you think that giving them something to believe in is going to be just a sociological theory, it doesn't work. People need something that touches their faith. People need God, even if you don't use the word God. And so communities are a wonderful way of helping people to live in a different way and offer others an example. People say, well, you're getting away from the world. Well, you can't get out of the world anyway. You could go on a desert island, you're still in the world. But the truth is that what they're really saying is, you're not like me and I don't like the implied criticism. The truth is, you've lived their life and you don't like it, and you want nothing more to do with it, and you'd rather be caught dead in a ditch than go on that way. That's where most of us are. It's certainly where I was. When I came to Master, I was just like a fish out of water, gasping for water. And what I found, I can say, although my coming to him was a whirlwind courtship, and he accepted me after I'd seen him half an hour, I have never for a moment had any doubts as to whether this was my way and he was my guru. Lots of questions, no doubts. I knew this was, I had lots of doubts about other things, especially myself. Nothing about these truths. Why? Because I see they work. And those at Ananda, and that's a wonderful thing about a community, it's a laboratory. People live in certain ways It works for all of them. People who don't live in those ways, it never works for any of them. You see that people who come thinking, what's in it for me? Where do I get mine? How do I become more important? How do I? They never are happy. Never. There's no exception. Those who think, well, God will take care of me. I just want to serve God in any way that I can. They're always happy. Jyotish and Devi had a child to support. Still, they put God first. They lost their whole house in the forest fire. Devi, 10 days earlier, had given birth to their only son. And it was a test for her. And Jyoti said, well, don't mind, dear. At least we don't have to worry about the leaks from the roof that we were having. They had this positive attitude. And with that, they've always thrived. And even when they didn't seem to have anything, they've thrived. Listen, there was a time when I lived on $10 a month. Now, yeah, $10 a month in 1963 was more than it is today. But it was not a gold mine. I had a lot of fun. Yes, I lost a little weight, but it was a great experience for me because I went to 2 markets that were local. This was in Sedona, Arizona, and saw the specials they had this day and that way. Oatmeal, a large bag of oatmeal, cost about 65 cents. I could live on that. I could, instead of buying bread, which was fairly expensive, I made chapatis out of flour, just as good, better for you, cost very little. If I made a dessert, I'd make it last a whole week. Just a teaspoon of it was a sweet taste, that's all I needed. So I'd have this dessert for a week, and lots of other little tricks I had to eke the money out. But you know, you can be happy with this. I was very happy. And the less you have sometimes, the better off you are. The more you think, I've got to make this payment, that payment, get this, get that. In the end, you wonder, where have I been? I still am the same person when I had nothing. When I came into this world, I had nothing, I was laughing. Why not be that way now? So living in a community is, the main lesson of it is that you can get along by living first for God. God first, God second, God all the time. And you find that really He does take care of you. And in amazing ways. Years ago, this is in 1973, I think it was, or 72, I felt guided by Divine Mother. I always think of God as my Divine Mother. And I felt guided by Divine Mother to go to India. Well, I had a little bit of money saved up from classes and so on, and I went to San Francisco 2 weeks before I was to leave, and my car threw a rod. It doesn't mean a thing to me, but that's what they said it is. And I don't think I could change a tire. But anyway, I was told that I really had to get a new car. Well, I had the feeling Divine Mother wanted me to go to India. Yeah, okay. I had a little money, enough to get me there and back. Yeah, okay. I didn't have the money to get a car. And I thought, well, I'll only be there 2 months when I come back. Living up there in the mountains as I do, I'll need a car. So common sense told me I need a car. So I spent several hours that day. I was with several friends of mine, and we were thinking, now, what should I do? What does Divine Mother want? She didn't tell me anything. So finally I said, well, Divine Mother, my common sense tells me I do need a car. And so you're going to have to see to it that you reimburse me. That's all. I didn't say, God, please. Well, just said, it's your business. If you want me to go, give me the money. And so I put down, it was $1,100 on a good used car. And that was that. But I didn't have the money to go to India. Monday morning, this was Friday evening, Monday morning, I got a check in the mail from somebody I'd never met before. He was in the army, he'd gotten out, and he wrote saying, I just want to do something for God after being in the army, and I want you to use this. Mind you, these were his words. Use it as Divine Mother wants. Incredible. How many people in our culture talk of God as Divine Mother? And it was just $1,000, just what I needed. So I got to go to India and come back. I've seen that happen in big ways and in small. And it doesn't mean that God sort of cleans the path for you with a broom. He'll often throw brambles in your way, sure. But I've found again and again, whatever the tests, you come through soaringly if you really have faith in Him. Say, God, it's your business. I know I picked up a hitchhiker back in 63, I think it was. And he gave me this hard luck story, and I gave him half the money I had, not thinking, well, is he genuine or is he not genuine? Didn't matter. I just felt that God had come to me with this, and I had to help him, whether it was genuine or not. And he said, well, I'll be sure that you get this money back, because I don't want you to lose faith in human nature. I said, listen, if I'd ever had faith in human nature, I'd have lost it years ago. I said, I haven't given it to you, I've given it to God. Well, he didn't give it back. No surprise. It came back in 100 different ways. I'll tell you another tiny little story. There are many I could tell. I was up on the Skyline Drive above San Francisco, and all of a sudden, no gas stations on that road, all of a sudden, I'd run out of gas. And I thought, well, I'm stranded here, what am I going to do? I saw there was an exit sign there, so I just took the exit. There was a downhill slope, 2 miles. Well, I just coasted along. Finally, it smoothed out, and I saw a gas station and turned in, and the car stopped right in front of the pump. I say these things to help you to understand that if you live for God, He takes an active interest in you. He'll carry you through. He may give you lots of bumpy rides. That's His way. He has a good sense of humor. But if you live with it, you'll see that you always come out on top. As it says in the Bhagavad Gita, know this, Arjuna, for certain, my devotee is never lost. You will never be lost. And this is what you find in communities, that when people live according to certain principles, everything goes well. When they don't, it doesn't go well. And when you see people in the world, it's very difficult to get that lesson. You don't see them long enough. You don't see them really dedicated in any direction. You get so many conflicting messages that to learn anything is not so easy. In a community, it becomes very easy. When the community lives according to the principle, Jata Dharma, Tata Jaya. Where there is Dharma, there is dedication to right action, there is victory. And it's so. The more you live in dedication to truth, the more you will find truth sustaining you. This is a lesson that our culture has not taught. We've taught and been taught the opposite. The more sly you can be, the more shrewd you can be, the more clever you can be, the more competitive you can be, you'll come out on top. Sure, you'll come out on top for a while. See the end of the road. Never works. Even if people die with their millions. Howard Hughes was asked a question a week before he died by some reporter on the phone. Are you happy? Nah, I can't say I'm happy. The guy was a living corpse. Money doesn't give it to you. Romance doesn't give it to you. Possessions don't give it to you. Worldly success doesn't give it to you. Fame, useless. Only one thing will give it to you, and that's your own self. And if you're happy in yourself, if you're comfortable like Diogenes in his tub, kings can't give you what you want. You can give it to yourself. Now, one further thought, and I'll end. I mentioned yesterday that you are as old as God. That's kind of a wild thought. You think you came into existence when you were born, but you weren't. You've been around forever. As I said again yesterday, Darwinists say, well, be honest, you're really an animal. I said to my father once, we're not just animals. He said, that's all we are. He belonged to that school of thought. I said, speak for yourself. Actually, I was too respectful to say it, but I thought it. But if you really want to be honest, then why not say, well, I'm just an animal, I'm a worm. I'm an amoeba. I mean, why not go back to the beginning? But if you go back far enough, you'll find that you're the divine who became all those things and then is trying to find itself once again. The more you can really find who you are, what you are in yourself, the more you'll find everything you ever want. You don't need to go begging to anybody else. Yogananda he wouldn't accept that we're his disciples. He said, God is the guru. You're his disciples. He lived that thought. When we used to touch his feet, he always went like this. He directed our devotion to God. The more you can see that God is helping God, the more you find, and it's an absolutely wonderful experience, wherever you go, you find people who consciously feel they're your friends. Complete stranger, but somehow they like you. I'll tell you one other little story. I have the practice of celebrating with Divine Mother when I finish a project. So when I finished my lessons, which is now the Raja Yoga course, I wanted to celebrate with Divine Mother, so I went to Carmel by the sea, not realizing or even thinking, well, this is August, and the tourists are going to pack that place. So I went there and found there were no rooms available. The only room available was, I went to this one inn, and it was much more than I could afford. I could spend it, but I wouldn't have had the money to get home again. So I thought, well, Divine Mother, I'm here to celebrate with you. I'll stay here. You just have to see to it that I can get home again. Well, you know, with that thought, what happened was that, first of all, I took out my wallet to pay me. He said, no, don't pay me. I said, why? He said, I don't know, I just like you. How many times has that happened? I can tell you, speaking for me, never. Just once. The next day I went to a restaurant, and some man, the owner of the restaurant, recognized me and came and sat down, wouldn't let me pay for lunch. So Divine Mother really made a celebration out of it. But you'll find the more you celebrate this life with him, with her, with your own higher self, the more you'll find everything works out. You don't have to worry about the details too much. So, to put it on a practical level, I would like to urge you to think in terms of asking yourself, am I satisfied really with what I've got? I don't think many people are. I think there's a lot of unhappiness in this world. Think about it. Living in a place like this is not running away, it's running to. Living in this place is taking on the burden, if you want to call it that, but it's a blessing of being useful in this world and not just producing more and more money to help an economy that is already a curse. Making people think that the richer I am, the happier I'll be, that's a delusion. It doesn't work. The best thing you could do with your life would be to live for God. Now, I know not all of you can. You may be married to a spouse who's not interested. Okay, don't worry about it. You can do it on your own. But when you can do it with others, it's so satisfying. Whenever we go anywhere with our own friends, they're such dear friends. I never had friends like that in my life before. This kind of thing is worth thinking about. That's why I hope in my trip here to encourage a few people on the West Coast to move here and encourage a few of you to join here and see if we can't really make a vortex of spiritual power, because we can. And as Master said in that lecture, I didn't come to start a sect, I came to start colonies. If you want to live for God, why not live with God? And if you want to live with God, why not live with others who also are living with Him? But mind you, having said that, I still want to emphasize, my goal is never to convert people to a path, to a place, to a thing. My goal really is only this, to convert you to yourself. Wherever you are, God has to come to you. Wherever you are, you have to know Him. In your own bedroom, in your own kitchen, there where you are is the only place God will ever come to you. Okay, this afternoon, if you want to ask questions, you can write me notes and I'll see if I can answer them. But I'm so glad to be here It means a great deal to me. And to see that people have come from far away, like Florida and Michigan and all over, it's just wonderful. I know that what Master has brought is great, and I am not a sectarian disciple. I'm happy, I bless everybody who's doing this kind of work, because basically it's a choice of God or mammon. Those who choose God are blessed. Those who choose the other are not so blessed. To a certain extent, it's not black and white, but the more you live for the world, the less you have of God. The street of life is very narrow. It's big enough for either you or God. It's not big enough for both. Okay.